There is a mystery pressed into the oldest written records that human hands have ever produced, not carved into granite, not painted onto cave walls, pressed, wedge by careful wedge, into soft, wet river clay, using the tall reeds of a land that no longer exists in any form that the first civilizations would still recognize today. Ancient Mesopotamia, the rolling flat plains between two great rivers where the air was thick with the smell of marsh water, and the sky ran unbroken in every direction. That is where some of the earliest written stories were born, and that is where this particular mystery begins. The tablets themselves are easy to overlook in a simple photograph. They're small, rough at the edges, the surface is covered in what looks, at first glance, like nothing more than shallow scratches. But those scratches are known as cuneiform, one of the earliest writing systems ever developed, and they encode something remarkable. They preserve the thoughts, myths, and administrative records of a lost civilization, one that was already ancient when Rome was still nothing more than a humble village on a hillside. Many of these tablets lay buried beneath the shifting sands of modern-day Iraq for more than 3,000 years before anyone found them again. Some were pulled from collapsed palace libraries. Others emerged from the rubble of primeval cities that had been swallowed so completely by time that their very existence had passed entirely from memory into myth. And when one takes a moment to consider the implications, here is what's truly remarkable. Of all the vast archives we have recovered, they are only but a fraction of what remains. Thousands more still lay buried beneath the ground, unexcavated, unread, waiting patiently in the dark, like the silent guardians of a forgotten age. And the tablets we do have, they paint a picture that is genuinely difficult to put down once you start looking at it. Texts like the Atrahasis Epic and the Enuma Elish describe a world that existed long before human comprehension. It can be hard enough to grasp the full weight of passing centuries, much less eons. Yet here we witness a primordial landscape still being shaped, when the first great waterways were being cut through the raw earth to give way to lush marshlands that stretched endlessly into the horizon. And in the middle of all of this, a divine hierarchy of immortal beings, a structured order of gods ranked by authority and function, governing everything from the movement of water to the cycles of the sky. At the top of that hierarchy sat the mysterious beings we know as the Anunnaki, the highly revered senior gods of the Mesopotamian pantheon, An and Enlil and Enki, and roughly a dozen others depending on which empire's traditions you follow through the years. They were the ones who held authority, the ones whose names appear again and again across centuries of records, attached to temples, to cities, to the earliest legends of creation, and beneath them, carrying the weight of the entire world on their backs, were the Igigi. 600 of them, according to some accounts, the lesser gods of heaven, assigned to the labor that the senior gods could not perform themselves. Not because they were incapable, but because their primary duties demanded they focus on keeping the very equilibrium of the universe in balance. And so, the task of maintaining the earth had fallen upon the Igigi. They had dug the first channels that became the great Tigris and Euphrates rivers. They had maintained the waterways, worked the earth, and carried the loads that kept the divine order running. The load was great, the toil was grievous, and for what was implied as enormous stretches of time, the Igigi simply endured, until suddenly they didn't. Because one day, according to the myth, they set fire to their heavy tools. They gathered in the night and surrounded the great temple house of the wind god Enlil, the highest active god commanding the earth's divine operations, where they refused to continue in what was essentially a strike of the immortals, organized defiance from a labor force that had finally reached its breaking point and was ready to declare war. The Anunnaki Council convened in something close to panic, trying to determine what to do with a divine workforce that had simply thrown down their tools and refused to pick them back up. And the solution they arrived at would echo forward through every civilization that came after them. Enki, the wise god of water and deep knowledge, proposed something that had never been done before. He would take the immortal life's blood of one of their own and mix it with the finest clay of the primordial earth. From that mixture came the first 7 men and women to walk the face of the earth. They would find themselves in the marshlands of Eridu, possibly the oldest city known to mankind, whose remnants can still be found in what is now southern Iraq. And from that moment, according to the epic, the labor of the Igigi belonged to them, to us, the canals, the fields, the endless work of sustaining a world. That is the story most people encounter when they first discover the Igigi. And it is a striking one, but it tends to end there, with humanity taking the place of these immortal workers, and the Igigi fading from the frame. This is the version of their story that stops too soon. But it is the way most people tell it. The Igigi rebelled humans were created to replace them, and then the they quietly disappeared, faded out, dissolved into the background of a mythology that had no further use for them. It's a satisfying ending in a certain kind of way. The workers go on strike, management finds a workaround, and the troublemakers get written out of history. But that's not actually what the texts show, because underneath it all is a question that rarely gets asked aloud, and it is far more interesting than it might first appear. Do the ancient records reveal what actually happened to the Igigi after humanity replaced them? Where did 600 divine laborers go once their purpose was handed to a newly created species made partly from their own blood? Did they simply disappear from the record? The ancient texts offer pieces of an answer, but those pieces require some patience to assemble, and the picture they form is genuinely surprising. Here is where the academic curiosity really begins, and it starts with something that scholars have found quietly puzzling for a very long time. Ancient Sumerian and Mesopotamian scribes were, by any measure, meticulous record keepers. That is the one thing everyone can agree on. The one thing no one questions. They listed kings by name and traced lineages across dynasties spanning centuries. They recorded the names of individual temples, individual priests, individual tracts of land, and who owned them. They compiled lists of divine gods, specific genealogies, tribute records, and incredibly detailed astronomical observations that should have been far beyond their understanding by conventional standards. If something mattered, they named it. They studied and categorized it. They gave it a specific identity and a designated place in the order of things. And yet the Igigi, across more than 1100 years of recorded Mesopotamian literature, remain almost entirely without individual names. They appear, again and again, as a collective, a group, a plural noun. They act together, they suffer together, they rebel together. They are described as a single body rather than a gathering of distinct individuals. Only a handful of the supposed 600 are named anywhere in the surviving texts, and even those names appear so rarely, and in such limited contexts that scholars debate whether they were truly Igigi at all, or simply associated figures from fluid, ever-shifting traditions. Even the membership of the group itself was never fixed. Different cities, different periods, different scribal traditions all assigned slightly different figures to the label. But throughout it all, they remained primarily as a group of lesser gods, whose identity was always tied to what they did together, rather than what any one of them did alone. It is a puzzle that has remained constantly contested across time. Why would a civilization so devoted to naming and classifying everything leave an entire category of divine beings without individual identities? Time and time again, they are referred to as an ambiguous group, rather than a singular individual. Perhaps we'll never fully understand, but from the memories of our ancestors, we can get a small glimpse. And interestingly enough, that collective voice seems to have persisted, even as their place in the cosmic order began to shift. Because here is what the oldest archives suggest, and what makes this particular thread of Mesopotamian mythology worth following, all the way to the end. After humanity was created to carry the labor the Igigi had abandoned, that same quiet and nameless lineage of immortals did not simply vanish from the records. Their purpose and place simply transformed, not with any dramatic announcement, but across the span of the surviving texts, something changes. This group of divine laborers, who had once dug the very first channels into the primordial earth, suddenly begin to appear in a different register entirely. They appear in the heavens. They appear in high council. They appear alongside the Anunnaki themselves, in the great oath that bound the gods at the edge of the flood myth, standing together as witnesses to decisions that shaped the entire world yet to come. Here we drift through the long shadow of our past, to gaze upon a workforce without faces, as they slowly morph into something that looks, from every angle, much more like a silent court of celestial guardians, watching from the heavens above. How that transformation happened, and what the records actually say about it, is what we are here to explore. And the gap between the popular version and what the records genuinely say is worth sitting with, because it's a genuinely strange thing. The Igigi didn't vanish after humanity arrived. Something more complicated happened to them. To understand what that was, you have to leave the Atrahasis Epic behind for a moment and follow a different thread, one that runs through a far less talked about Mesopotamian text, called the Anzu Myth. This is a story that most people outside of academic circles have never encountered, but it survives through the ages in a fairly complete Akkadian edition from around the 1st millennium BCE, and even older fragments that push the tradition back much further than that. Here the Igigi appear once again, not as a distant memory, not as a reference to something that used to exist. They appear as a functioning institution, as a thriving group with a seat at the high table, a voice in divine deliberation, and a formal role in the political and cosmic machinery of the gods. That tells you something important. It tells you that whatever the Igigi became after the labor substitution, it wasn't worth dismissing. So here's the story. At the center of the Anzu myth is a crisis, and it's the kind of crisis that in theological terms represents genuine catastrophe. The tablet of destinies had been stolen. And if you're not familiar with what the tablet of destinies was to the ancients, it's worth slowing down for, because the heavy stakes at play here only make sense if you understand what it was, and what it meant to the stability of their entire reality as they knew it. Because this particular tablet wasn't a physical object like the clay artifacts we see covered in cuneiform inscriptions. It was a symbol of legitimate cosmic authority and an object of supreme power. Whoever possessed it held the authority to decree fates, to determine outcomes, to speak with the binding force of the divine law itself. It was, in a sense, the operating system of the universe. And the right to hold it was the right to govern all of reality itself. Being the highest active force of the supreme triad, it was Enlil's to carry. And then, one morning, it was gone. A creature called Anzu had taken it, a divine bird-like being, enormous and ferocious beyond words. Anzu was described in the texts as having the head of a lion and wings that could stir the very sky. He had been granted a position of some honor in Enlil's household, allowed into the inner chamber, trusted with proximity to the most powerful object in existence. And one evening, while Enlil was in his bath chamber in a moment of vulnerability, Anzu took the tablet and fled into the mountains with it grasped tightly in his talons. The moment he did, divine authority collapsed. Commands lost their force. The gods found that their decrees no longer held. The entire order of heaven was suddenly suspended, hanging on nothing, because the thing that gave it weight was gone. This is where the Igigi enter the picture. When the news of the theft spread through the assembly of gods, the reaction was one of collective paralysis from the highest to the lowest ranking among them. The Anunnaki gathered, and with them so did the Igigi, sitting speechless and terrified in the heavenly assembly halls. There, in what the myth clearly presents as a formal convergence of the entire divine council, they processed the crisis together. They mourned it, collectively and in silence, the kind of response you have to a catastrophe that has no immediate solution, but one that every conceivable measure must be taken to avoid. Nobody spoke because nobody knew what to say. The tablet was gone, the chain of command was broken, and the gods, for all their power, were effectively without a framework for doing anything at all. What's interesting about this scene is the position the Igigi occupy in it. They aren't there as servants. They aren't being commanded to do labor. They're sitting in assembly with the highest of the Anunnaki, participating equally in a formal response to a divine emergency. They're witnesses. They're an institutional position. Their presence in the room matters because their presence is what makes the council fully complete, fully balanced. By this point in the mythological tradition, the Igigi had already settled into a recognizable role in the hierarchy of heaven, not at the top. The Anunnaki retained that. But they are still very present and very much part of the structure. The council's task was to find someone capable of going after Anzu, crossing the mountains, and defeating this impossible creature to recover the tablet. Several gods were proposed, and each of them declined. The texts are specific about this. The fear of Anzu was genuine. Even the most powerful of their divine warriors hesitated. But eventually the choice fell on Ninurta, the storm god, son of Enlil. And when Ninurta was appointed to the mission, the Igigi were among those who stood witness to that appointment. Their presence at the moment of his commissioning wasn't incidental. It was fundamental. It made the appointment official. It bestowed the full weight of unanimous divine recognition upon the moment their hero had been chosen. That's a fundamentally different role than the one they occupied in the flood stories. In Atrahasis, they were the workforce, the ones who carried the pickaxe and the basket, the ones who burned their tools and refused to dig. In the Anzu myth, they are part of the governing assembly of the cosmos itself, gathered in heaven, decreeing fates alongside the Anunnaki, and bearing witness to the judgments that shaped reality. The transformation between those two images is remarkable, and it happened relatively quickly across the traditions as Mesopotamian theology evolved through the centuries, shifting emphasis, reshuffling the cosmic hierarchy, and reassigning their names and places within it. No temples were built for them as a group. No individual Igigi god accumulated a dedicated cult, a set of rituals, a city that claimed them as its patron. They remained collective, a category rather than a congregation of named beings. But even so, by the time the later Babylonian and Assyrian versions of these myths were being written down, copied, and read aloud, the Igigi had become a category of celestial deity. Sky gods who helped their more supreme counterparts keep the balance among all things. The workers of the earthly realm had become, through some strange process of spiritual evolution, gods of the heavens. They gathered above. They gave praise. They assembled to witness the movements of the supreme rulers of the cosmos, and their voices joined the great declarations that rolled through the world like the strongest of storms. It's things like this that tend to get overlooked when scholars trace the Igigi through vast volumes of ancient texts, works written by different priests, in different temples, in different periods of time. Their rebellion story is dramatic, and the creation of humanity is theologically rich, so those legends absorb most of the attention. But if you follow the Igigi further forward through time, something unexpected happens. They don't fade. They don't disappear into the footnotes of history. Instead, they rise. Their identity transforms in ways that the earlier narratives give almost no hint of. And another, one of the places you can watch that transformation most clearly, is in the work of a woman whose name most people have never heard, even though she holds a record that belongs to all of human history. Her name was Enheduanna. She lived in the 23rd century BC, more than 4,000 years in the past. She was the daughter of Sargon of Akkad, the ruler who built what many historians consider the world's first empire, at least by modern-day definitions of the term. Sargon had appointed her to be the high priestess of the moon god Nanna at the great temple complex in Ur, which was one of the most powerful religious positions in the ancient world. But what makes Enheduanna remarkable, beyond just her lineage and her role, is her way with words. She was a writer. She composed hymns, prayers, and poetic texts, and then when her work was done, she signed them. That detail sounds small, but it isn't. As far as scholars can determine from the surviving records, Enheduanna is actually the earliest named author in all of human history. The first person we can recognize and identify by name who put words together and said, in effect, I made this. Prior to that, ancient scribes felt no need to declare ownership of their work, for how can one claim knowledge that was not their own? They had spent countless generations recording the divine wisdom bestowed upon them by the gods, and then copying that information down through the ages as their understanding grew. But it was not theirs to claim. They understood it to be the physical manifestations of an intelligence that was already at play long before they took their first breath. Yet here we see a sudden display of individual ownership. One of her most studied compositions is a text that translators have called Inanna's Elevation, or sometimes the Exaltation of Inanna. It's a complex hymn addressed to the goddess Inanna, and it moves through praise, lament, and cosmic declaration in ways that still feel vivid, even in translation. But the primary reason her works are relevant to this mystery lies in the specific word she chose when she referred to the Igigi. She didn't use the labor context at all. She didn't reach back to the digging or the rebellion or the years of heavy toil. Instead, she used a Sumerian term that reads as Nungal, which translates literally as the great princes, or in some readings, the great sovereigns. That's the frame she chose to place around them. Not workers, not rebels, sovereigns. And that's very important to our historical understanding of how the Igigi were viewed. Enheduanna was not just a casual writer. She was a trained priestess, operating at the highest level of temple scholarship in one of the most literate cities of the ancient world. The words she selected carried weight. When she called the Igigi the great princes, she was drawing on a tradition that had already elevated them well past their origins in the labor myths. Here, within the institutional memory of Ur's temple culture, the Igigi occupied a position of genuine cosmic authority. And to better comprehend how that elevation was portrayed in the language itself, it helps to look at how the more common name of Igigi was actually written to begin with. This is where the lost tongues of antiquity become even more interesting, and you don't need to know anything about cuneiform to follow it. The name itself incorporates a duplication of the ancient Sumerian sign for the word eye. The sign for eye in the old tongue is Igi, and the name Igigi repeats it. The eyes, the watching ones. Some Assyriologists translate the name as the ones who observe. What that means is that embedded in the very spelling of the name, at the basic level of the written characters pressed into clay, is the concept of watching, of seeing, of vigilant attention directed outward across the cosmos. Think about what that does to the labor narrative. The Igigi began in the texts as beings defined by what they carried, what they dug, what they built with their own two hands. But the name itself, the cuneiform identity they carried through every text and every century, was not about hands at all. It was about eyes. And when you move forward through time, away from the flood epic and toward the hymns and legal prologues and the celestial catalogues, that ocular identity becomes entirely dominant. Any other context falls away, and what remains is the image of beings who watch, who preside, who can see the whole picture of things from somewhere above it all. That shift reaches another kind of institutional confirmation in one of the most studied documents from the ancient world. In 1754 BC, a Babylonian king named Hammurabi issued a collection of laws that archaeologists wouldn't recover until 1901, inscribed on a tall black basalt stele. The Code of Hammurabi is famous for its legal content, the 282 rules governing everything from trade disputes to medical liability. But the prologue that precedes the laws is a different kind of text entirely. It's a declaration of cosmic legitimacy. Hammurabi wasn't just announcing rules. He was explaining why he had the authority to announce them at all. The prologue states that the great gods Anu and Enlil, for the well-being of the people, elevated Marduk to be great among the Igigi. That phrase is the key. Marduk's elevation, his designation as the foremost deity in the Babylonian pantheon, is validated specifically by elevating him through the procession of the Igigi. By this time, the they had become the first reference point for appointing supreme cosmic authority. To say that a god stood proudly in the eyes of the Igigi was to say that he stood at the top of the divine order itself. What that means for the legal code is significant. Hammurabi was a human king, deriving his authority from a god whose very sovereignty was defined in relation to the Igigi's approval. The chain of legitimacy ran directly through them, even though they weren't named individually themselves. They functioned as a collective test of divine supremacy, the way a throne functions as a symbol of kingship, even when the king is standing beside it. And in this context, their power came precisely from their collective anonymity. The Igigi, as a group, as a council, as an assembly of watching sovereigns, held a kind of authority that no single deity could have conferred on Marduk alone. There's something almost structural about the way they function in the Hammurabi prologue. They're not characters in the story, they're the framework within which the story of divine authority is told. And that is a long way from the image of gods setting fire to their tools outside Enlil's house in the dark, exhausted from many long years of digging. The same name, the same collective, but occupying a completely different position in the cosmic architecture. What Enheduanna and Hammurabi show, separated by roughly 5 centuries, is that the Igigi underwent a transformation in the textual record that was neither accidental nor gradual in a simple direction. It was a deliberate repositioning. In the oldest hymns from Ur's most accomplished priestess, they appear as the highly regarded princes of the divine realm. In the founding legal document of Babylonian civilization, they appear as the council of highest authority, the body against which a god's right to rule is measured. The eyes of the ancient world, watching from above, far removed from the burdens of their past. But perhaps the most astonishing shift in their legacy came even earlier, from somewhere quieter and in many ways far older in feeling. It comes from the sky itself, because when you move beyond the later traditions, beyond the creation stories, and into the great astronomical and celestial compendiums of ancient Mesopotamia that lie somewhere in between, something remarkable had happened to the Igigi. They had been written into the fabric of the heavens itself. The texts that reveal this most clearly include works like the Enuma Elish, a massive collection of Babylonian astronomical omens compiled across centuries, and the Epic of Era, a poem that deals with cosmic order and divine authority in ways that still puzzle scholars today. What these texts show, when you read them carefully, is a complete transfer of function, where the same Igigi who once dug canals and labored in the earth were clearly described as the very hosts of heaven. They maintain the harmony and stability of the celestial spheres themselves, operating under the decrees of the highest Anunnaki gods, from Enlil in the older Sumerian traditions, all the way through to Marduk in the later Babylonian interpretations. The labor is still there, in a sense, but the labor has been elevated beyond anything recognizable from those earlier texts. To realize what that actually means, it helps to understand how ancient astronomers divided the sky, and this is where a text called the MulApin becomes essential. It was, in essence, a cataloging document, compiled around the early 1st millennium BCE. Over hundreds of generations of watching the sky from high temple platforms, the ancient priests of Mesopotamia had developed a way of organizing what they saw into 3 distinct regions, 3 paths through the heavens, each assigned to a high god. The furthest and most remote region of the highest realm belonged to Anu, the supreme sky father, the most distant and most powerful member of the Anunnaki Council. Below that sat 2 parallel bands of the sky, one assigned to the wind god Enlil in the northern arc, and one assigned to the water god Enki in the southern arc. Together, these 3 gods formed what you might call the highest-ranking trinity of the cosmos, the Anunnaki in their most concentrated and authoritative form. And this arrangement wasn't symbolic in any loose or decorative sense. It was functional. Stars and constellations were assigned to each path, and the path a star traveled told you which divine authority governed it. But all the while, just below the highest heavens in the space between Anu's remote domain and the lower atmospheric bands where weather and earthly life played out, sat the Igigi. That intermediate region, that middle heaven, was theirs, not the unreachable heights of the supreme gods, not the earthly atmosphere where humans lived and breathed on the very same land which they had once so carefully tended to, but something in between, something that was elevated, but still very much connected to the workings of the world around them, both above and below. And this placement matters more than one might initially think, because the Igigi weren't simply decorating the middle sky, they were governing it. The texts describe them as the controlling intelligences of planetary time itself. Think about what that phrase means for a moment. The movements of Jupiter, which the Babylonians called Marduk or Nibiru, the path of Venus, identified with the goddess Ishtar or Inanna, the morning star, the measured arc of the moon, the god Sin, and even the daily journey of Shamash, the sun god himself. All of these movements, as far as the ancients were concerned, were not random or meaningless. They were guided, they were maintained, and the entities maintaining them from their fixed positions across the middle heavens were the Igigi. It's worth investigating the specific logic of how the Igigi made this cosmic system work. Fixed stars don't wander. That's what makes them fixed. And in astronomical thinking, the fixed stars weren't just passive background objects. They were structural. They formed a kind of permanent framework, a steady canvas against which the wandering bodies of the planets, the sun, and the moon could be tracked and measured with utmost precision. Priests standing upon the high platforms of the ziggurats used their fixed positions to calculate when planets would appear, when they would reach certain points in their cycles, and even when eclipses might be expected. The Igigi were the unwavering luminous entities filling the lower vault of heaven. Without their guiding lights, the movements of everything else would be far harder to read. They held the visible universe in place, in a very real conceptual sense. The ancient texts described them as structural pillars of a kind, holding up the roof of the sky and keeping the different paths properly separated so that the sun and moon wouldn't deviate from the schedules that governed everything below them, from the floods to the harvests to the proper timing demanded by everything in between. And then there's the question of the gates, because the sun and moon didn't simply exist in the sky in Mesopotamian thought. They moved through it. They rose and they set, and that rising and setting required passage through specific waypoints along the horizon, what the texts describe as the gates of the eastern and western skies. These weren't metaphors in the way a modern reader might assume. They were distinctive features of the cosmological map, precise locations where celestial bodies crossed the boundary between the visible and invisible portions of their journeys from one end of the distant skyline to the next. The Igigi were also said to have functioned as the guardians of those thresholds. They were the ones who opened and closed the horizons at the right times. They ensured that Sin rose when he was supposed to rise, that Shamash completed his arc and descended on schedule. The precision here is important because Mesopotamian religious practices depended heavily on celestial timing. Omens were drawn from deviations, from anything that happened earlier or later than expected. A god who rose at the wrong time was a god delivering a message, and the beings responsible for keeping that from happening without cause were the Igigi, standing at the edges of the visible sky, marking the boundaries between order and disruption. What the astronomical texts are describing here appears almost as a kind of cosmic bureaucracy. And the Igigi, who once formed the laboring underclass of the divine hierarchy, have become its most structurally necessary tier. Not the gods who issue the final decrees, not the supreme council deliberating over mortal fates, but the ones who make sure the machinery of the heavens keeps turning, the ones who hold the framework in place so that everything else can be read, measured, and understood. And there's something profoundly ironic in that. The Igigi, in the earliest myths, were defined entirely by their relationship to work that had been imposed upon them by those above them. Their most widely recognized act was a rebellion against that toil. Yet here, in the celestial texts, the Igigi are no longer defined by labor in any diminished sense. They are defined by a higher function, by a position amongst the most luminous deities of the heavenly tapestry. By necessity, they are not constantly grounded in the earth anymore. They are holding up the sky above. And this is where the records get genuinely strange, because the Igigi don't only help guide every luminous body seen dancing across the starry expanse. Some of them were reassigned to a different, yet equally important task within their elevated positions. The Enuma Elish, one of the most complete cosmological texts to survive from ancient Mesopotamia, describes a sort of reorganization of the heavens. Once humans were in place and doing the labor the Igigi had refused to continue, an interesting designation was given to half of their collective population. It is said that 300 Igigi were stationed in the sky, not as rulers exactly, and not as administrators in any political sense, but as something closer to a perpetual choir. Their assigned function was to guard the decrees of the divine council through ritual and sound, through constant hymn and constant praise, singing the laws of the holy May into a kind of permanent stability, and locking the very frequencies of those laws into place. It was a stunning example of the kind of profound early understanding that the ancient Sumerians held about the underlying ordinances of the natural world around them. And it is worth sitting with for a moment, because it isn't purely symbolic in the way we might assume. It's a complexly woven framework that intertwines the underlying frequencies of the universe, the gods who reigned over its highest realms, and how it all interacted with very real, physical manifestations in the earthly realm. In this worldview, the laws of heaven were not perpetually self-sustaining, not all on their own. The ingredients of life were there, and they always would be. But they required maintenance. They required will. They required a united voice. If the Igigi stopped their chanting, if they abandoned their stations and went silent, the framework that held the natural order together would begin to unravel. The sky would stop behaving like the sky. The boundaries between things would soften and blur. Their singing wasn't a pious or prideful declaration of authority. It was load-bearing in a way that is difficult to comprehend. It was a part of the ether itself. That's a remarkable thing to record, and it tells you something about how the ancient Mesopotamian mind understood the relationship between sound, ritual, and cosmic structure. The Igigi had gone from digging the primordial soil of the earth to maintaining the invisible architecture of the future. The work was still endless. The obligation was still total. But the nature of it had shifted entirely from the physical to something much harder to define. What's also worth noting is how the texts describe the number 300 with a kind of precision that feels deliberate. Not an approximate crowd, not a vague estimate. 300. Assigned and stationed. This seems a lot more like the language of an organized system, rather than a myth reaching out for vague grandeur. Whether that precision reflects an older accounting tradition, a symbolic structure within the theology itself, or something else entirely, scholars are still working through. But the specificity is there in the clay. Now, of course, the cosmic division described in these texts didn't fully crystallize all at once, and the clearest and most systematic version of it comes from a much later period, what historians generally call the Middle Babylonian Kassite era, running roughly from around 1592 to 1155 BCE. This was a long stretch of history under Kassite rule, and it produced a remarkably organized theological framework. What the scribes of this period seemed to be doing, at least in part, was taking older, sometimes contradictory mythological traditions and sorting them into a cleaner cosmological structure. It did what large institutional reorganizations tend to do. It gave everyone a place, resolved the tension in the hierarchy, and made sure the ones who had caused the disruption were far enough away that the disruption wouldn't repeat. The Igigi question got a definitive answer in this sorting process. The senior Anunnaki, the older and more powerful tier of the divine hierarchy, were permanently assigned to govern the deepest spaces within the earth's interior, the underworld, the realm of the dead known as Kur. If you've spent any time with Mesopotamian mythology, you know that the underworld in this tradition isn't a place of punishment, exactly, but it is a place of permanence, a place from which there was said to be no return. And for the very few exceptions that did, well, they didn't return the same way they had left. The Anunnaki going down into that realm carries a weight that the texts don't entirely unpack, but that you can feel it in the language. They weren't being demoted. They were being rooted in the foundations of all things. The Igigi, meanwhile, went the other direction completely. They ascended into the orderly structure of the divine maps that the Babylonian scribes were trying to depict. The sky became their domain entirely. And even while becoming the deities of heaven, they retained the grand power of unity through their collective voice. While the Anunnaki retained their distinct personalities across different texts and under different names. Enlil with his ultimate authority and his temper. Enki with his undisputed cleverness and his compassionate sympathy for all mortal beings. Nin-Hersag with her role in creation at the very beginning. The only gods whose names the texts took effort to differentiate were the ones who had given the orders. These figures remained recognizable as individual characters across centuries of literature. The Igigi did not. As a group, they rose. As individuals, they dissolved. They became a category, a collective noun, 600 presences behind a single label. And the stars themselves were understood as tangible expressions of their divine presence, populating the sky with former earthly caretakers, whose individual names the traditions had simply refused to use, the ones who had carried out the work, refused it, and had then been elevated into the celestial realm to become a part of the sky itself, where they would remain for eternity, unnamed and constant, always present and rarely asked about, the beings whose rebellion had forced the creation of humanity, whose refusal to keep working had changed the very shape of the cosmos, ended up as intrinsic figures in the same heavens at which they'd once gazed upon wishfully from below. And no matter their position, their tireless dedication to maintaining the grand order would never cease, would never fade, would never be swept away by fading memory. Their legend lives on, in the fragments of our past and the memories of our ancestors. And so the story settles, the way all old things eventually do, into quiet, not the quiet of an ending exactly, more like the quiet that comes after a long fire burns down to its last steady glow, the kind of quiet where nothing is missing, where everything is simply at rest in exactly the place it was always meant to be. Somewhere above the shadows where those ancient clay tablets still sleep in their museum drawers, wrapped in careful darkness and the soft weight of centuries, the sky continues its slow, unhurried rotation, just as it has been doing for a very long time, longer than the scribes who pressed the first cuneiform marks into wet clay, longer than the rivers that carved the valleys where those cities first rose from the mud. The planets move along their ancient tracks with a kind of patience that has no human equivalent. No rush, no deviation, just the steady, almost breathing rhythm of spheres turning in their designated arcs, each one positioned exactly where the oldest calculations said it would be. There is something in that precision that the mind doesn't fully process as much as simply feel. A settling, a recognition that beneath all the noise of recorded history, beneath all the labor and the rebellion, and the long negotiations among gods and men, there was always this, the silent geometry of the sky, organizing itself night after night, above every civilization that has ever looked up at it in wonder. Deep in the basement archives of the great museums, the tablets rest in their shallow trays, The script on their surfaces is still there, faint in some places, sharp in others. The marks of a reed pressed into clay by someone whose name was not marked down. The language hasn't been spoken aloud in 2,000 years, and yet the records remain, untroubled, waiting patiently in the darkness, still holding whatever they were asked to hold, without complaint, without effort, simply resting in the way that very old things rest when nothing more is required of them. It's profound to think about, the idea that something can carry so much and then simply be still. The Igigi, in whatever form the later traditions imagined them, became something like that, not absent, not erased, just elevated beyond the reach of ordinary noise. The texts that mention them grow fewer toward the end. The references thin out, and what replaces the detailed mythology is something quieter, a general sense of their presence above, unnamed and unnumbered, watching the way that very old things watch, without urgency, and without demand. The stars they were said to govern still glint along their paths each night, each one moving at exactly the pace the ancient astronomers catalogued. The Babylonian sky charts still describe a universe organized into stations and watches, as though the whole of the heavens were a kind of duty roster for beings too old to need instructions. And underneath all of that, the earth holds what it has always held, fragments of fired clay, pressed into the deep layers of soil between the two great rivers, the broken edges of tablets that were never recovered, the impressions of hands that have long since dissolved back into the ground. Countless small objects still sleeping in the dark earth, preserved by the same indifferent weight that preserves everything that sinks low enough and stays still for so long. History does not end. It simply moves at a different pace. It shifts from the urgent and the spoken into the patient and the buried, into the slow accumulation of sediment over stone, into the drift of sweet flower pollen settling into still marshlands, into the faint chemical trace of fires that burned before anyone thought to write anything down by its light. The planets continue their turns. The tablets rest in their quiet drawers. And somewhere above the old valley where the first city stood, the sky is doing exactly what it was always doing, moving in its slow arc. We sleep now in that quiet embrace, in the comforting continuance of history, as the stars around us steadily hold age-old positions, patient and unhurried in the stillness of night.